Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 19th annual What's Hot, What's Not event by the WCA. I thank each one of you for coming to this event. You should have a really good time learning about some of the trends that are going on in the industry today. A couple of housekeeping things. If you don't already know, the bathrooms are off to the right. And if you decide to go out on the patio, please don't go out the gate. Just stay in the patio area. And then we'll be following all the rules. Also, of course, enjoy the food and beverages while they're here. The more you eat, the less we have to take away. I'd like to say a couple of thank yous first. The first thank you is to Asbull. Asbull is a company that sponsors a lot of these WCA events, and we're really appreciative of that. And we want to say a big thank you to Asbull. And I think it's Jim. There you are, Jim. I'd also like to say thank you very much to the Silicon Valley Bank. This is an awesome venue. Clearly, it holds us it was a little tight last year, as I guess many of you recall. So, Jim, can you say a few words?
Well, thank you for coming, and we're thrilled to host the WCA event tonight. It's something that we at SVB really take pride in as being part of the ecosystem. So in the 35 years that we've been in business, we've built the bank based on our relationships with people in your space and in other spaces, in other technology spaces. So it's the reason for our growth is because of events like this and folks like you. And so we're very happy to host. Just a short commercial on SVB. We've been here for 35 years. We've grown a lot. In the 20 years that I've been at the bank, I think when I started we had maybe $5 billion in assets, and today we're close to $70 billion. And we have about $30 billion in loans. And so it's a growing bank, and again, it's really a reflection of our area and all the great things happening and everything that you're doing to support the ecosystem. So thank you very much.
I'd also like to introduce some of the folks from the WCA that are here to help today. Peter Walther is our vice president and runs most of the programs around here. I know you all know him, but thank you, Peter. Jeremy's part of the Asbull organization and also a contributor to on the board of directors of the WCA. So thanks, Jeremy. Tom. Armand helps us with social media and a lot of the marketing programs. Stu Jeffrey has been with WCA as a board member since its inception, I think.
Way back then.
Who am I missing? And then, of course, myself, I'm Tom Mitchell. If you have any questions for us, please reach out. We're always looking for volunteers. We're always looking for speakers. So if you have topics that you think would be germane to some of our upcoming events, please do reach out. If you have a special skill that you'd like to contribute to, the WCA, some of these events, please do reach out to us. And then the last thing I'd like to point out is that we've got an event coming up in January. I think it's January 28th, which is our annual Spectrum event, Spectrum 2020. So you're all invited to check that out and come on and visit us in January. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Lisa Oshima, who is very skilled at managing this event and has done it for quite some time. So Lisa, take it away.
I don't think so. It's not working.
Is it? Yeah, it is.
So, all right, you guys can hear me right now? Okay, great.
Louder.
Louder?
Really close.
I'm getting as close as I can. How many of you guys have been to this event before? Okay, so how many of you are seeing my face? Okay, hey. So thanks guys very much for coming today. It would be really helpful for us in starting things off before we do the introductions, just to get a feel for the room. If you guys could just raise your hands if you're on the engineering side of the business. Okay, so probably about a quarter. And then for those of you on the business side, just raise your hands so I can see who didn't raise their hands. Okay, so a few more business folks and technical folks here tonight, so we'll try to keep this geared at both. But I'm Lisa Oshima. I'm a business development, strategy, and marketing consultant working in the wireless industry and for emerging tech companies. I've been doing it for a little over 15 years now. I own a business called Socialize and Mobilize. Right now I'm working with a really interesting client, which is called Always AI. It's alwaysai.co for those of you who are interested. They make a really easy to use developer platform for creating computer vision applications at the edge faster than ever before. So I'll let my colleagues here introduce themselves and we can get the conversation started from here.
Okay, shall I start? So my name is Bill Reichert, and I'm Managing Director of Garage Technology Ventures. Garage is a seed and early stage venture capital firm. And relatively recently, a couple of years ago, we affiliated with a larger international venture firm called Pegasus Tech Ventures. So I'm also a partner at Pegasus Tech Ventures, which is a global venture firm with $1.5 billion under management that invests all over the planet in generally later stage. So I go from 2 guys in a garage, 2 gals in a garage, a guy and a gal and a dog, all the way up to pre-IPO. So I'm having a lot of fun.
Yeah. So my name is Tricia Solinero. I'm a managing partner at Woodside Capital Partners. Despite the fact that it's Woodside Capital Partners, we're no longer in Woodside. We don't have capital. So I'm just making that, but I am a partner.
You are a partner.
Okay. We do M&A advisory. So we help companies, generally on the sell side, about 75% of our clients are sellers who are looking to find buyers or looking for private placements, later stage companies often. Our transactions are in the lower mid-market, so we call them 25 million up to about 250 million.
So is my mic working? Because I got a different mic. Is it picking me up?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Good.
We got everybody's got a different mic.
I got a different mic here, yeah. But I can't talk under my breath, I guess. Eric Zimitz, I'm here representing myself largely. I was at Granite Ventures, so I have been in venture capital. Prior to that, I was at Hamrick & Quist, if you remember that name. So I did a lot of work in investment banking as well, and have been involved in the wireless business for quite some time. I've had the good fortune of meeting a lot of you, most of you out there at one time or another, and I'm here because they keep inviting me to come back. So have a good time. So hopefully I'll be able to share some interesting thoughts with you.
And I'm Steve Goldberg, and I know many of you. I've been in a similar situation as both these guys. At one point in the venture capital community, I'm actually still affiliated with Venmont, but not there full time anymore. And been there 10 years, kind of being, among other things, the wireless guy. And before that, ran a couple of small companies, and before that was a wireless engineer for a long time. These days, I spend about a third of my time doing the venture capital thing, half a dozen boards in wireless and tech companies. I do expert witness services, IP litigation, mostly in wireless, GPS, telematics, that sort of thing. And just for personal reasons, stay pretty close, just because I love it, stay close to the wireless industry.
You're going to say soccer ref.
I didn't say that. Although I do have radios now. Finance, the lost radio.
So thanks guys for introducing yourselves, appreciate it. I think we're going to start off with a topic of conversation that we've been talking about for at least 3 years, and that's 5G and how it's going and when we should expect that 5G is going to make its real mark. In this last year, things seem to have accelerated pretty quickly. We've got a lot of investment both in the US and China and Korea, all over the world in 5G, and so I'm curious to hear, guys, we've all been kind of together now for a few years now, well, at least most of us. How do you think it's going?
Well, slower than we thought. I don't know. Well, I don't know. How many people think it's been slower than we expected?
We expected it to go slow.
Yeah.
Okay. And how many think it's faster than you expected? Anyone? Really? Okay. So, you know, it's been interesting, and there are a whole bunch of reasons, right? I mean, so there's some technical reasons and standards reasons, and there's some geopolitical reasons, and we can be, I don't know if we want to talk about, are we going to talk about China? I don't know. Are we going to talk about Trump?
That's part of it right now too.
That would be good, but, you know, and then I guess a question is, economic reasons, right? Is it because looks like it's going to be really expensive to deploy? And is it, is anybody like pounding, I mean, as far as the carriers are concerned, we are not pounding on the table saying, gotta have 5G. So the question is, where is the, one of my favorite Steve Goldberg lines, where's the knife in the neck sort of pain?
I still love somebody else, but I do like it.
Knife in the neck, whatever. So who's got the knife in the neck that demands 5G? And, and so we're not
the Chinese government. Because
well, yeah,
right, that's what we saw here in the last month, that they, deployed 130 million users, right? So it is unbelievable what you can do if you have complete regulatory control and the ability to deploy, that many antennas in a short period of time. I don't think we're gonna get there.
But you're making the antennas.
Yes.
Well, and you're probably making the numbers up too.
Yeah.
Right,
No.
the 130 million is not audited by anybody as far as I can see. The, and, I think we've talked about the idea of 5G being, more of an ideal than a technology, right? As opposed to the other wireless generations, which were very much technology driven. There was an air interface, and everybody standardized that, and they built silicon, and the silicon showed up in phones, and people were, in 2 to 3 to 4, right? And 5G is not really that, right? It's been a very different journey for the industry. And, I guess my thinking's evolved a lot too, right? I view 5G as kind of a, call it a pavilion, right? There's a lot of heterogeneous elements that fit underneath that pavilion, right? A lot of the things you think of as traditional cellular, right? What they call sub-6, and they also have the low bands as well. So that's gonna, be more what you think about classic cellular phone, smartphone type interactions. But then you have the whole millimeter wave concept as well. And I gotta say, I'm surprised at how much faster that technology, how fast that technology is showing up in devices, right? At all.
And small devices.
And small devices, yeah. And they kind of sort of work, right? I mean, I've played with them in controlled environments, and they work, right? I mean, I'll ask, what if I hold my hand here? And they'll say, well, don't hold your hand there, right? Because it won't work if you hold your hand there, right? You gotta keep your hand away from the antenna. But, there's been some good progress, I think, and the industry's starting to feel it a little bit. So we'll see whether they can keep the momentum up.
Feel it in which way?
Feel it like they think it's a real thing, and they're getting excited, people want to get behind it, and everybody wants to talk about it.
But to your point, is it a real thing or is it many things?
It's a real thing that encompasses many things.
Okay.
We've talked about this, can you hear me okay? Yeah, we've talked about this in past years, and I think it's playing out exactly the way we discussed. And maybe a different word is aspirational. Think about cellular, there were always the hole, I'll call it holes, or the shortcomings. You couldn't control latency, and you were limited in bandwidth, and you had the urban kind of cell story, and you had the suburban rural cell story, and they were slightly different, and you rolled out the cell size differently, and then they got better at cell splitting in the urban areas and using the different frequencies in the rural areas and figuring out how to make the towers bigger and making it like trees so nobody knows and that kind of stuff. But I think, the 28 gigahertz stuff is, I guess, for the purist, or the wireless people, that's the most interesting thing of all of it, because as you just said, we kind of know the sub-6, 600 megahertz, we kind of know how that works, 3.7 gigs, we kind of know how that's going to work. It's the 28, 38, and 68, or I don't know what the 65 gigahertz. And what's in my head, and this is, it's one of those things I never talk about, it goes back when I got out of college in the mid-70s, my first job was with a company called California Microwave. It was one of the early companies in Silicon Valley. It did some military and some telecom. But I was the microwave guy, and I sat on the bench, and I did 20, 30, 40, 50 gigahertz stuff. And all I can remember from those days is that, and you can't fool Mother Nature, nothing has fundamentally changed. Extremely finicky, very, very, very hard to do repeatable production. Obviously, things have improved dramatically in a gazillion years, but it's still, I think it's just a very, very, very specialty case. And when it ultimately comes down to it, I was doing some homework for the talk tonight, for the presentation. I mean, the cost of some of these phones, right? I mean, and the notebooks, the small notebooks, they're in the $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 range. And that'll only come down with volume, but you just gotta wonder how quickly that'll happen.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at what Apple just did, and we all just lived this last year, was it the 11 that came up? I think it was that the first one that kind of hit $1,000? Yeah.
The 10.
And now they've decided, maybe we ought to rethink this. And I guess the one that's coming out in January is gonna be $399. They kind of hit a limit. And I just think it's gonna be a while before the technology that people envision that needs to be in the phones for 5G is gonna get enough volume to do any good.
Well, wait a second, Steve. I gotta tell you, I'm looking at my phone right now, and it says I've got a 5G connection. Are you telling me that, is it possible that AT&T is lying to me? Is that what you're saying? It says right here,
I don't want to scare
5G.
you, but don't hold it too close.
My wife's already taking care of that. So, but, okay, well, wait, I mean, it actually is curious to me that the FTC does not, I mean, it seems somehow inappropriate that they can put 5G on my phone and pretend.
Well, don't forget.
Is there a lawyer in the room?
Now here's the cool thing. Because so first of all, we all know there's the the front half part of all the wireless, but there's the back end too. And so there's all of the infrastructure services that is also a big part of 5G. And so if they put one new box in, they can generally say that.
Well, there's actually a lot of that stuff's more in the future even than the radios and phones are going to be. And in some respects more interesting, or as interesting as just the
So
radios.
here's the cool thing that just got announced. I just heard about it yesterday, and I think it's just within the last couple of days. So I've told you this in past years. I'm on the board of directors of a very small company called Savari that does vehicle-to-vehicle communications. They started out with the DSRC, which was the Wi-Fi based. It sits above the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi stuff at 5.9 gigs. There was an allocation for Wi-Fi based vehicle-to-vehicle and vehicle-to-infrastructure communications. It basically was stillborn. It never really happened. There was going to be a mandate for every vehicle to have one of these modems in the car. I would say not just pretty much, but no one's really done it. Just now, this year, some companies in China and maybe 1 or 2 brands in the US have the modems in there. The market now has moved to a cellular version that'll likely be in the same band. And the coolest thing happened today, and it's actually a 5G announcement because it's part of the 5G standard. It's that the band that was originally allocated, I think it was 75 megahertz, was allocated for what's called DSRC, is now going to be split. It's going to be an NPRM, and pretty much everybody in this room noticed a proposed rulemaking where the FCC goes out, asks industry, get questions answered, and finally they make a rulemaking and it becomes law. So they announced that they're going to take 45 megahertz and attach it to the high end of the Wi-Fi band, so there's a little bit more 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. They're going to take 10 megahertz and assign it to cellular V2X. So it's the first statement that there's actually going to be a cellular V2X pushed by the FCC. And then there's, I guess, an extra 10 or 20 that they may split on, but they haven't decided exactly what they're going to do with that. But it was a 5G announcement, it's the real deal, and hopefully that'll push the use of the whole vehicle-to-vehicle communications, and it's kind of made it on 5G. So that's actually something new.
And those are the things that start to drive the M&A activity, right? I mean, so there's been a lot of activity around autonomous and around, V2X and enabling cities in certain areas and tolling and all of those good things. And it's announcements like that that end up, driving those late stage, investment announcements and, small deals.
I was just looking today and I saw a report that Tricia provided, which I thought was very interesting, and they say that global autonomous vehicle market will grow to 556.5 and change billion by 2026. So we're seeing a huge opportunity, I think, in the car space.
I'll take that bet.
Does anybody want to bet? Yeah.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to bet on this?
Yeah,
So-
I'll take the under.
Do you think, yeah.
So this is my question, because
Okay.
I think we all have been in the wireless, most of us have been in the wireless industry for a long time, and we've seen how fragmentation in that market is really challenging and has kind of changed several years ago with the advent of the iPhone, and kind of converged in a lot of ways. With now basically you're left with two big OSs kind of dominating the handset market. Cars, I don't see a future like that, where there's going to be a lot of innovation driven by startups that want to work with these very difficult to work with, slow moving, fragmented.
Are you talking about the cellular industry or the auto industry?
Both. I've seen the
okay.
parallels
It
between
sounds like
both.
they're both actually.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to hear, do you guys think that number is correct? I mean, that's the sort of number that's being bounded around as being the future. Do you think that number is correct? And how realistic do you think that is when we think about what's hot in the wireless industry right now? How quickly do you think we're going to be able to reach all these vehicles doing these things that everyone says they're going to do, and this ecosystem budding around that?
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think everybody reads the news about autonomous vehicles, and I would argue, just to make a point, 51% of that is regulatory and safety, right? I mean, it might be 99%, but it's at least 51%, right? That's because the technology's there. I mean, we can all see it. Some people have it in their cars right now. I mean, it works pretty, except for the corner cases, works pretty darn well.
Well, sometimes you do have to turn the corner.
Yeah. No, but you're right about, I mean, as exciting as 5G for automotive is, the automotive industry is the automotive industry, and I didn't say it was gonna happen quickly, I just said it was starting to happen, so.
The timelines of auto, they're designing into cars that are 3, 5, 7 years out, right? And then those cars have to have at least a 10-year lifespan. So as you start to build up those numbers, it actually grows fairly quickly. And like you said, it's mostly around safety, it's around vision, it's not actually about, self-parking and, driving having a mesh network on the freeway that's gonna communicate between cars. That stuff, I think, is much further.
I'm just fascinated to hear this because it really feels like the car industry and the cellular industry are converging, right? Because it already takes 3 years to get into a cell phone, right? If you're going to get designed and forward, 2 or 3 years is very common. And people used to turn their phones over every year, and they don't need more. So I don't think it'll be 10 years for a cell phone, but it's probably rapidly moving towards 5, which is part of the issue with that business. It's not really as attractive or interesting as it used to be. Smartphones it is.
I feel like, and I'm not embarrassed to say this, but I'm trying to make a joke, and I have to make sure I throw in a few technical things every once in a while, just for the engineers in the audience.
Red meat.
So, red meat, right. So, I was telling Eric before we started, I think since I saw you all last year, I've probably seen, and this is embarrassing to say, I've seen a dozen wireless deals in the venture biz, probably a dozen, maybe one new one a month. They've been interesting, and one of them, actually, and they're all with very experienced people, and you'll hear about them. This one in particular, I'm not an investor in it, I just got to hear about it, and I know the people. But it's a new GPS chip that basically leveraged some of the new GPS satellites. There's new frequencies on GPS and new modes. It's not just the original 2, the military and the civilian frequencies. They've got new frequency now, and enough satellites have these new modes, and the performance for commercial uses is dramatically better and will be dramatically cheaper. And so there's actually a very well-funded startup now that's looking at new GPS applications. We talked about last year about the guys that were doing the real-time kinematics, sort of the centimeter level accuracy stuff, real low cost, for staying in the lane for automotive stuff, those businesses are still going. And so from the wireless technology point of view, you know, that area is still active. Not clear it's easy to make a buck as an investor, but certainly the market is demanding movement in that area.
So, I mean, to just, on the other hand, Steve, so you're saying you've seen 12 deals, wireless
It's a very
deals.
small number.
Right, which is, but what you're saying is pure play wireless, right? At some level.
Yeah, I was
You're
trying
sort of,
to.
you know, you're saying pure play wireless, because the flip side of it is that now wireless is in everything, right? It is in everything and everywhere. And, you know, now you know, and people are experimenting with all variations of it, but almost everything now, I mean, it's, you know, now with obviously we got IoT. So IoT is, you know, that's all wireless, right? And now industrial IoT, and now we got edge computing, right? So now we have edge computing, and you can't cable everything together. You got to do wireless. So you know, we're massively increasing the number of antennas and wireless connections that are out there. It's hard, you know, everybody's tweaking it. I don't know if there's any sort of breakthrough innovation because as you said, you can't fool Mother Nature. So there is only so much bandwidth, and we keep, you know, figuring out how to do it more cleverly. So everybody's tweaking their way around the bandwidth they can get. But wireless is everywhere. It's you know, much more pervasive than it was.
I think what you're describing is the
Okay.
5G ideal, right? Which is,
Okay.
because once upon a time, not that long ago, even today, you know, was largely a single device you were worried about reaching, right? It's a smartphone. That's the predominant wireless device, the largest technology market in the world. It's the largest technology market that ever really existed by volume. It's smartphones. But yes, there's all these new devices you need to connect up, right? It could be an industrial machine, it could be a doorbell, it could be a camera, it could be an automobile, and all these things have different requirements, right? That single cellular network that was built and optimized to send voice and data to a rectangular piece of whatever, plastic and metal, glass, isn't necessarily suitable for all these other devices. And that's, I think, really the impetus of the whole 5G vision. Hey, we need a network that's got a lot more flexibility, a lot, you know, better characteristics around latency, for example, that can start, you know, addressing these opportunities and delivering services that are relevant to the market.
And low power as well. So that kind of brings me to,
And that's another app.
you know, low power, wide area networks, and how those are working. And there's a lot of fragmentation even in that. Any thoughts from you guys on what's hot in that area right now?
Actually, so another company I just saw recently that addresses the IoT low power, and that just following what Eric said. So cellular, in a perfect world, would be the answer to everything. It's ubiquitous, prices are coming down, volumes are really high. But for a lot of applications, one, it's still too much power, and it's still too expensive. Even at $50, $30, $20, $10, still too expensive. I just heard about a new, I think they're still in stealth, but we'll hear about them soon. It's basically a Bluetooth company, but it's so low power that they actually have product now that works with energy harvesting devices. And people have been talking about that for a while, but this is actually a funded company that's working on, you can only imagine the number of devices if you could actually put in some sort of energy storage device with energy harvesting and Bluetooth. That gets you to the Ericsson 5 billion devices pretty quick. Right? So it's not a pervasive movement in the marketplace, but there's strong demand.
Well, and cost-wise on something like that, I mean, that's kind of what interests, I'm very fascinated by the economics of all of this stuff. Because if you think about, you know, every device you have in your home right now probably has some sort of microcontroller. And each one of these microcontrollers, you know, does certain things. Some of them do things very, very well, very specifically, but these companies aren't putting processors, like real processors, into these devices because of the costs, right? And you think about that company you spoke about, and I wonder, cost-wise, will we ever see companies like that succeeding in a market where everyone's trying to lower COGS, and no one wants to have any sort of increase on their product costs, because it means that it won't ultimately sell to consumers, but in the big scheme of things, actually that, in and of itself could really change markets, right? Like if you could get that in more things, and we talk about changing markets. What do you guys think about the economies of the wireless industry right now, and some of these new technologies, and people are placing their bets on certain things? I'm kind of curious what you think is hot in terms of that kind of technology.
I don't know if you can see, well, okay, so another way to frame it is everything's hot, right? So it's hard, it's hard to find anything that isn't susceptible to some digitization, instrumentation, connectivity, control in our lives, right? So it's, it used to be, boy, long ago and far away, back in the 80s and 90s when we would talk about smart homes, right? Remember we would talk about smart homes? And we thought, we would have a computer that would, sort of manage. And, well, two amazing things. One, we still don't have smart homes, right? But we have this sort of creeping intelligence, right?
1,900 things in the house, right?
Right. So now we have all this creeping smartness that keeps on, nobody has been able to come up with a top-down massive scheme for creating a smart home or a smart building or a smart city or a smart anything. But we're seeing this sort of bottom-up creeping, ecosystem evolution of, smart things popping up. So I would not sort of chase anything in particular that's hot. I would just look for opportunities because costs are to come down, right? So we're gonna, sort of all the various elements of cost are gonna come down. We're gonna get smarter and smarter about lower power and, higher reliability. And so we're gonna enable more and more things to be connected. And so what do you want connected next? I mean, I don't know. What's the next big thing to connect?
There's a lot of things people don't want connected.
Right.
And this leads me to another exciting area for wireless, which is edge, right? Because edge computing does bring to the table a whole bunch of interesting opportunities for things that can be connected and keep certain things at the local level, and then transmit other things through wireless networks, reducing latency, potentially reducing battery power usage. What do
I think the way the industry thinks the edge, though, is more of a extension of the cloud, right? Not the edge necessarily all the way down to the premise, but the idea of distributing the data center so that you can really lower latency in some of these processing, the applications that are processing in the cloud. So instead of having to haul from Seattle, Washington to Arizona, right? You can locate a data center, an edge data center in Phoenix. So I think that's an important element of the whole 5G architecture. And one of the real big contributors to lower latency is taking that round trip to do that. Ultimately, though, you could take the edge right to the premise. And
and people are.
I
mean, and you've got this.
That's what Always AI is doing right now with the.
Okay, there you go. I mean, so you got this explosion of chip companies, right, that are designing chips from 2 millimeters square on up that are doing AI inference right at the edge. The edge could be your ear, right, or it could be your pacemaker. But
the advantage of doing that is that, to Liz's point, you can bifurcate what happens to the data, right? So many people are so worried about, who owns that data that's going to come out of that sensor, that device, and so licensing that piece of it, where does the AI happen? All of the data aggregation is, I think, really very much at still under consideration.
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to be kind of the next conversation.
I think it could be potentially a really interesting extension of 5G, if you think about it, because if you're trying to figure out ways to reduce, if you're trying to figure out bandwidth constraints and how to manage bandwidth constraints, if you're doing more on-premise, at the edge, the way that I'm referring to it on-premise, then theoretically there's a lot of interesting things that could happen with regard to data, with regard to speed at which things are processed and so forth. I don't know if you've seen that much
Well, and you know, the other advantage of Edge is that you don't necessarily have to have an internet connection, right? And so it's one of the issues with autonomy is, you know, the car itself has to be smart enough. You can't depend upon it being connected to the internet in order for an autonomous car to be autonomous.
Right.
So, and the same with a pacemaker or a hearing aid, right? Yeah, depending on how far.
The
you know,
premise that you
wanna go.
described too, Lisa, a lot
Yeah.
to play in the industrial IoT world, right? Where you have a lot of sensors, you have a big sensor factory and all kinds of data coming out, and the ability to kind of, you know, manage and determine what data is relevant enough to send up to the data center,
Mhm.
and which is
Yeah.
just kind of garbage, or if you need to make a real-time decision.
And
You can't
smart
really
cities as
afford the
well,
round trip
smart
time.
cities,
That
cars.
could be
Right, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think that you asked about IoT and we're talking about 5G. I think there's still, I mean, over the years, we've talked about all the wireless problems that have kind of been solved. And coming to this event, I always try to stretch myself to think about which ones haven't been solved yet. And sort of in this discussion, I saw another company, and this one was interesting because it caught me off guard. And you think about sort of the continuum of, let's call it sensor networks or IoT. I mean, you know, what was that company, Tile, where it's like a Bluetooth thing and it keeps track of your keys or your cell phone or whatever. So that problem's kind of been solved. So real close in, not too expensive, but within meters, right? And we know the real high-end thing, if you wanted to put a tracker on an aircraft, you know, you could spend $1,000 and kind of, it's the high-end RFID. There's actually still a gap in the marketplace, sort of in the, I'll call it the $5 to $20 endpoint cost that gives you location to within a meter or two and range within hundreds of meters. There isn't technology that does that. Because you can't use cellular, it's too expensive, Bluetooth doesn't work far enough. They don't fundamentally have location unless you have some sort of a specialized network. GPS, adding GPS, you add too much power to it. So there's these 4 or 5 constraints of, you know, cost, power, location, range, something like that. And there's this zone in there where it's interesting. So it sort of pops up.
Give us the use case. Give us the
use case would be
yeah.
Walmart putting them on high-end device, you know, putting it on a TV set, a television set in a Walmart store, you know, or maybe it'd be hard to walk out of the store with a TV set, but even something smaller.
Even tracking
Razor blades.
pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
Sort
doing
of
that
something above, you know, a men's shirt. That may be, you know, there were people for a while working on RFID at the inventory level, you know, none of them made it because they just, at least not with wireless, because it was just too expensive and the infrastructure was too much. That problem hasn't gone away, and just above it, I've even, one of the things I heard about with this company was they were like airport, you know, the trucks that pull the luggage carts, you know, when they unload the plane and bring them to baggage claim.
Making those autonomous.
They can't afford $50 or $100 per truck. So it's gotta be something a little bit less than that. There isn't a technology out there to do it. And so there's this kind of zone. So again, in the spirit of pure play wireless and IoT, all the problems actually haven't been solved. I completely agree that everybody wants all of them solved, but there's still a few.
Totally.
Well, they're solving
No,
with
totally.
different
I-
technologies
yeah.
now, so they're solving with like vision technologies,
Yeah.
right? You know, to overlay other systems.
Yes.
To basically, you know, try to get these corner cases.
Right.
Well, and you know, and I still lose my call every once in a while on 280, right? I mean, so that's not, so it's not.
They haven't solved the basic issues.
It's not,
yet,
you know,
exactly.
again, it's not knife in the neck, but on the other hand.
That's bleeding from there.
Yeah, so, but there are, you know, right now, probably half of the developed world still has crappy bandwidth. I mean, most Europeans still have crappy bandwidth. And plenty of people in Los Altos Hills have crappy bandwidth. And so, it's not as though that is even solved, and I'm not even talking about, the other 5 billion people who are lucky, who might have POTS phone internet connectivity.
You probably can look this up on the, when I was doing research for this panel, there was a multi-page New York Times, it goes like a week or two ago, multi-page New York Times section on 5G. So
really?
they covered 10 different topics, and just interestingly, one of them had to do with the rest of the world. Because I'll keep it short, but one of the interesting things about it, I really felt they were stretching to find these extreme AR, VR things that almost, Silicon Valley, we talk about it, but nowhere else in the country will they even do that. It's still pretty out there. When they went to talking about 5G for the rest of the world, for Africa, they talked about the geography that was covered in Africa, which was like 90+%, but then the number of connections was like less than 10%. So the services there, people just don't have it, they just can't afford it. So I mean, the 5G thing, which we already know, is forget talking about it in those places. I mean, they're not even at 3G.
Well, okay, so I'd be curious, so there is, we got a bunch of guys now talking about putting thousands of low Earth orbit satellites up there, and relatively cheap receivers, on Earth to give you, 100 megabit plus bandwidth for $50 a month. I don't know. I mean, that doesn't solve the Africa problem. Well, it sort of could if you could have aggregation. But is that the future of internet connectivity? Are we gonna, so none of these guys are carriers, right? None of these guys are AT&T and Verizon and Comcast.
They want to be resell to carriers, I think, their general business model, right? They want the local operator to buy bandwidth.
Well, it depends.
I gotta say this.
Yeah.
I mean, we all read our morning email newsletters. I mean, they're launching them. What was it? Didn't OneWeb just launch 50 or 60 satellites?
That was Starlink. That was SpaceX.
SpaceX.
They put
there's a bunch
120.
of launch systems. Oh, SpaceX launched their own.
Right.
There's a dozen companies.
And OneWeb and Viasat, and
so I mean,
all these guys.
As tough as I've been on these guys, because we've been watching this, they've been talking about this stuff for a decade or more. It's kind of starting to happen.
I agree it's starting to happen. My question is it a reflection of technological advancement or low cost of capital? Because we did this once before, we pretty much failed, right? And maybe things have really improved, the technology's gotten that much better.
Arguably, they are low Earth orbit, so the latency in the range, the range is better, and cost of hardware is much lower.
You remember Global Star?
Yeah, but those were different.
Qualcomm Star, I can't remember what, 4 or 5
But those
right?
were
They all busted terribly, right? They went bankrupt, they restructured, some of them had businesses that emerged post-restructuring. But, yeah, it was a business that didn't play once.
But it puts pressure on the carriers.
And one of the reasons they envisioned these LEOsats was because there was no terrestrial infrastructure for wireless. Now we have all that. So really, what is the need for these networks? I'm a little suspicious myself.
Yeah, what bandwidth do you get in your house?
I'm not gonna get better from a satellite.
Interesting. I'm sorry.
I can't get a cell tower a mile away to get inside, so a satellite.
Yeah, so Lisa, what are we talking about now?
I am very interested in sort of what you guys think about another area of conversation would be smart cities. And specifically, we talk about, the wireless industry moves slow, it's for profit. The automotive industry moves slow, it's for profit. The government moves very slow and clearly is not for profit. And there's a lot of interesting lobbying and other things that happen.
Depends on
work for, yeah.
Ours.
Oh, okay. Right.
So questions for you guys. What do you think is kind of hot in this wireless space around smart cities right now, and what is just noise?
It's mostly through Savari, through my connection there with the vehicle infrastructure stuff. That company basically bootstrapped itself for the first, up until today, being an infrastructure provider to smart cities.
Right.
So they're in Tampa, they're involved in New York, and a few of the big, city says, we got this much government, federal money, and we want to do smart parking, and a lot of it was smart parking.
It's all revenue collecting.
Yeah,
That's how you fund it all.
And I would basically disagree with what they say. It's been, I'll be kind, it's been very disappointing. It really was money floating around. It really was, there was no real pull on the marketplace. It didn't need it for smart parking because there's private companies that have been funded to do that. And all of the other stuff was sort of just testing safety issues for cars, traffic management. And because the vehicles still don't, the mass market vehicles still don't have them, they were kind of just playgrounds for a couple dozen or a couple hundred cars. So my personal experience with smart cities is it has a nice ring to it, but nothing's really happened.
Yeah, I think there are private companies though that are coming in that we're seeing that are thinking of basically using the fast track that's in everybody's cars already and using that as a tolling device, right? So now as you get into range of the McDonald's, it's gonna, send us some information, right? So there's a way to use that both for revenue collection on the parking side, on the toll side, and those sorts of things, but edging its way into, a new revenue opportunity based on who you are, where you're driving every day, and the type of marketing and advertisement that they can do.
We'll make the point earlier about, the markets happen from the top down, or they percolate from the bottom.
Yeah.
Right? In my sense of smart cities, it's one of those markets that's going to percolate up. Because, where I see some interesting activity is around public spaces. Think about like a venue, right? You go to a stadium and the surrounding areas, and it's kind of a city, right? 100,000 people show up at a stadium and they all want service. And increasingly you're seeing, those networks transition from, get something there so people can attach to something and whatever, right? And now I think some of these venues are seeing that as a platform they can monetize, right? They put the network in place, and then they can get people on board, and they can sell them stuff, right? Or they can, get other service providers to try to sell them stuff and get paid just to give them access to these users. And you think about events that percolate. Think of the Super Bowl, right? The Super Bowl is a massive event. But there's probably like 20 city blocks around the Super Bowl where there's almost a festival going on. Unless it's in Minnesota, I think they have to think about something else then. But, it's a warm weather climate, right? There's a lot of activity. And again, so that's a smart city. It may be a temporary smart city, but it's certainly a smart city. And I think things like that give even city planners the vision on, hey, what can we do here on a bigger scale, right? And, concert events, I think, are another, another example of how this occurs. Not in the city, but sort of organically.
I think you're right. I think you're right. I question also whether there are, especially in our modern times in California, Northern California specifically, where now the power can get shut off at any particular moment. You look at communities that were deeply impacted by wildfires. Those are the same communities that were also deeply impacted by the PG&E outages that happened recently. And so public safety is something that I'm seeing a lot of people bottom up kind of talking about. You see cities now kind of having to react because people aren't having the wireless coverage while there's these outages, and it's harder and harder for people to be communicated with in a way that they feel good about when there's either an impending wildfire or the power is out and they're trying to figure out what's going on near them. People are feeling exposed. I would kind of argue that there might be some interesting smart cities opportunities bubbling up as a result of those specific.
I don't think those are wireless problems. I think that's just sort of wireless logistics. Networking and logistics and infrastructure issues.
I think you're right.
Everybody's got a cell phone. If you can figure out how to keep the cell towers up.
But interestingly, in a lot of these environments, the cell phone towers weren't up, and there's a lot of stuff that's happening, like AT&T talking about how they're having to reimburse clients and give stuff away for free when actually they couldn't deliver during those times. So I think it actually has huge implications for the wireless industry as a whole, because when you think about it, now no one has a landline, and so everyone's depending on wireless, especially in these very, very difficult kind of low power situations. Which is what she says.
Yes, and I think also, Stephen, in a remote area for public safety, there may not be the larger the wireless pieces may be in place, may be more of a systems integration issue. But when you do start getting density, right, I think then it is a network issue, right? I don't think a lot of wireless networks are built to handle, to deliver services in those dense environments.
On the infrastructure.
Yes, the infrastructure side, right? And I do think
Yeah, and
that's something that the industry can apply technology to and
But how many of you guys were impacted by those outages? Just curious. Yeah, not a huge number in this room, but you know, where I'm based in the East Bay, and I think a lot of the peninsula and then up in the sort of Santa Cruz Mountains and the hills, a lot of those folks were impacted pretty badly. And it's interesting, right? Because in the Bay Area especially, you've got people who have multi-million-dollar homes who find themselves in a position where they can't communicate, they have no power, and things start to happen because they get confused and frustrated by something that happens to them in that instance. So, for example, in our area, we're like, you know, you got to write to the FCC and tell the FCC this is outrageous that Verizon and AT&T can't keep bandwidth rolling while there's no PG&E power. And it's just fascinating to me because I think that's going to become potentially a huge problem if something actually does happen when the power's out and these towers can't communicate.
They clearly prioritized voice, actually, during that situation, so we live in a happy day. And only the phones, thank you. Only the phones worked, no data retrieval,
Yeah,
no
so-
anything. Yeah, it was crazy.
Only voice.
Yeah.
Huh.
So we're getting up to that time where we're almost ready to take questions, but I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to just give me your 2 cents on what the hottest thing is in wireless right now from your perspective, and what the thing is you think is most overhyped. Starting with Bill, go.
Most overhyped is 5G. You know, the hottest thing, I think, in terms of global impact, I think these satellite internet connections are going to sneak up on us, and I mean, Starlink is going to turn them on next year, and you know, all of a sudden, I think you're going to see a pretty interesting dynamic going on in terms of who is providing your internet connection.
So, most overhyped 5G, the hottest thing 5G though, right? I mean, so I think there's a really interesting opportunity, I think, for, you know, areas that we're seeing that are more entertainment focused. I think, you know, the Warriors are thinking about, you know, how do we put, you know, AR, VR glasses on, you know, people next to the sideline of the game so that someone in
So they can't see the game, is that what you're saying?
Well, so that someone in Japan can watch, right? And, you know, how do you keep the latency down on that so there's no betting issues? You know, and there, you know, we have another client that's working on protocol exchange issues because they're tracking all the sensors on NASDAQ cars and how, I mean, on NASCAR, and how to, yeah, this is too much finance in my life, on NASCAR, I need more NASCAR, and all the sensors on the cars, and how do you transmit that to, you know, the people in the stadium? And so, I mean, I think there are real legitimate entertainment, small venue uses that will drive some of the innovation in the market, especially around latency.
And I'm going to say, repeat what you just said, I agree completely. I think the most overhyped is 5G, only because the hype's all wrong, right? When usually you hype 5G, it's just, it's blather, right? People are just sort of spitting out words and they're missing the point. But it is an exciting opportunity that's emerging around 5G. And, you know, and I think an element we haven't touched on at all, I think, is unlicensed elements here, right? I think Wi-Fi is going to be a really exciting market. You know, there's two things going on. There's a brand new standard coming called .11ax, and they've wisely rebranded that now Wi-Fi 6.
Wi-Fi
6, yeah.
I'm getting there. Give me a chance. Yes, Jeff. Wi-Fi 6, right?
Yeah.
And so it's one better than 5G, obviously, because it's 6. 5G is a 5. So it's Wi-Fi 6, and a lot of the elements people talk about in 5G are going to be part of Wi-Fi 6, right? The idea about power control and MIMO antennas and low latency, and also there's a big block of spectrum coming in, right? That whole 5 to 6 gigahertz is going to be available for, guess what? Wi-Fi 6 exclusively, right? So I've followed wireless industry for a long time. What I've always learned is, took me a long time to figure this out. Took me a long time to figure this out. Is when you get new spectrum and new technology, like good stuff happens. Good stuff starts happening, and that's really what you got going on in the unlicensed band right now. This, you know, this Wi-Fi market can be really dynamic. Don't sleep on Wi-Fi. I think it's going to be a really exciting thing.
All right. So again, in the spirit of pulling the position of the wireless purist, So I broke them into 3 categories. Overhyped 5G, just because. Yeah, we'll see eventually. The real deal, but kind of out of the reach of most of us, which is the new satellite stuff and sort of wireless guidance of autonomous vehicles. It's gonna happen, the technology's there, but it ain't there yet. And I'll add to your wife, I think, the real deal, and it's still very viable, very exciting, a lot of money to be made, and a lot of places for innovation, I find Bluetooth. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there's still lots of places to go, there's still problems to be solved, and the numbers are really big, so it's interesting.
Can I throw out one more thing too? Because it just came to mind when you speak. One thing I see is ultra wideband. So say a couple of ultra wideband startups come up, and it's all around ranging in motion, right? And Vikas has seen some of this as well, right? The idea about home health care, right? So senior care, if you can take some type of very low cost radio that can detect motion, that can get some sense on presence, you can come up with a pretty innovative solution around home health care, right? Think about elderly care, you can tell what people are, what room they are, you can detect falls. Yeah. So it's I think it's a pretty clever market.
And it's really
I love when old technology like that have just failed miserably sort of resurrect and things like that.
I think you can do that today with cameras and
But why cameras though, Lisa? No one wants cameras in their house.
If they're on the edge, they love them because they don't do anything except for like communicate with the.
You know what? It's that's actually that's really one of the impetus for these business plans. The idea that most people don't want to be spied on, and they don't want cameras filming them.
So I want to jump on Eric's point and point out that and just extend it to radar. I mean, all of a sudden radar is popping up. I mean, LiDAR is past the hype curve, I think, unfortunately for LiDAR, but well, maybe I'm wrong. But radar just seems to have this interesting resurgence in terms of all these applications around the world that you never thought about because you always thought of radar being military, blah, blah, blah. And now, right? And now it's showing up in your cars and monitoring the elderly and, all sorts of sensing you can do with radar. Non-invasively, right.
So one thing we didn't touch on before we go to the questions, and I know Eric was dying to talk about this, so I was going to give you a tee it up for you, is 6G. Is that something you said you wanted to mention? No, I think it was like 96 gigahertz. Maybe that was somebody else.
That might have been somebody else actually. Yeah.
Okay. So 95 gigahertz.
It wasn't in your
Yeah.
Okay.
Everybody wants a tank radar.
Yeah.
We sent out a little email before, and someone mentioned, I thought it was Eric, I apologize, it was really interested in 95 gigahertz and above, sort of if there's hope for that, what that looks like.
There's hope for everything.
All right. So moving on. I'm sure there's a lot of questions in the room tonight. Why don't we get the mic and rope around for some questions?
Here comes
We've got a
Tom.
roving mic. Tom's making a move.
Okay.
The ringers in the front row are dying.
So in the spirit of bringing back old technologies like ultra wideband, which I've also heard a number of new startups in, body capacity networking. For body capacity for health monitoring, both the consumer kind, the Nikes and the Adidas who are now making smart clothing, as well as more serious health monitoring. Are you guys hearing anything in that area?
I've heard people talking about it. I mean, would you consider that? I guess it's not exactly wireless because it is physical continuity, right?
Fair enough. But there's no wires.
Yeah.
I think it's a great technology. I think it's fascinating. I've never really seen any startups in that still myself, or any.
There's some coming out now with new technologies. Apparently, it fixed the old problems because it's been something we've been talking about for 10 years.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great area.
Yeah, I mean, we saw startups that their whole big idea was if you touch a box on the shelf, your body completed the circuit that caused signal to launch a data element that said, "Ooh, look at what's happening on the shelf."
Pay for those pretzels in the hotel. Yeah.
There are some
Well, there's that too.
applications for that, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Nothing more important than watching the pretzels.
That's right.
It's cost 10 bucks.
I would say one thing related to the we talk about wireless every year, and this, I think this comes up every year, but it's one of those things. Once you have the concept of untethered, you have the issue of batteries. And one of the challenges is really hard to fall under nature again. With batteries, you know, every 10 years you get a new battery technology, and that it's improved some. It doesn't, you don't get the Moore's law improvement in the battery business. And I think if there was a top 5 list or top 3 list of what holds back the use of wireless,
All of us, right.
it's batteries.
But to your point, you mentioned the ultra low power Bluetooth before, and the body capacity is the same way. The power is so low that energy scavenging is really easy. Like the body capacity, you put a Peltier device on that, it'll run forever.
But that's why that's so cool, because one of the real, you know, hindrances and anchors on moving that kind of technology forward is the power.
So I'll ask you a question on that is if you have energy scavenging with a wireless device, it will broadcast forever. You throw these things away and they keep broadcasting. So you now have RF pollution everywhere. Think about that.
Actually, the whole power question is another question that we talked about last year. For those of you who remember, I'm just curious to hear if anything's changed in that world. Wireless charging, wireless power, anything new that you guys have seen that's interesting in that space? We haven't talked about that at this time.
It seems like we are going to work. So I was in. Let me just answer this real quick. I'll keep it very short. I was in Israel a month ago. I hadn't ever been there. With my last name, it was something I had to check the box. So and I met with a guy who runs a wireless power business, and it was kind of fun because I know there's some people in the room that work for, at least one person I know in the room work for a wireless power company. I think the realism is sort of back in. It was one of those hype curve things, you know, the Gartner hype curve, where it was, oh, this is really, really cool, and then people realized the FCC was never really going to allocate or going to allow enough power for you to really do anything interesting. And then people started to find applications where, you know, charging a battery, trickle charging of certain things. So I kind of, for wireless charging, I think we're on this part of the curve, at the very end, and there's companies out there that actually, I know 3 or 4, they're actually selling product, mostly for specialized applications. But sort of the holy grail of you being able to be in this room and your phone was charging while we're here, we're not there. And that, I don't know of anybody who's still working now. They may be, but
I know people who are working at it. It's just, I think it's a tough slide. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi. Wanted to know with the advent of Starlink, what are the threats to 5G? And what could stop generation Z plus kid or somebody out there to keep a mini antenna in his backpack and completely ditch the cellular service because it's straight away next to Starlink?
Well, I'm not exactly sure of the scenario you're painting in terms of whether or not that's that would be a big concern. But I mean, I think there are two different systems and connections. So I guess I'm not entirely getting the question.
Yeah,
Starlink disrupt 5G service, terrestrial 5G service. Is that the gist of?
You mean just RF interference? Is that what you're saying, or you're saying some hacker?
No, for general consumer communication from one place to another. So if I'm not actually connected to the modem with the hard line going to Earth, and I'm simply connected via antenna to Starlink for my 50 or 100 Mbps.
Right.
So what's stopping me to keep that, taking that in my backpack as a battery-powered antenna and always be connected to satellite?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's like, but if you had a choice between just walking around with a phone and walking around with a phone and a big antenna in your backpack.
No, but it cuts my bill by $150 for the entire family per month.
I don't know.
My 2 kids wouldn't care. They'd pay the higher bill.
No.
Although there are places though where you antenna as a service, right? You can imagine that some people would be willing to carry the antenna to provide services to others, right? DAC is a hotspot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, right. I think businesses will take advantage of Starlink to create hotspots. so that you can get, high bandwidth, on your phone via Wi-Fi, right? But I don't know that you would have a choice between a cell phone, a 5G cell phone, or a Starlink cell phone.
I think it's gonna be a really, really, really long time before the mass market turns in their cell phones, and just look at the numbers.
Yeah.
The 5G numbers, at least marketed, forget what they really are. They're marketed, when you're 100 feet at 28 gigahertz, you're talking like 3 gigahertz, 3 gigabits downstream. The satellite guys aren't, it's just, it's a very, the pure 5G marketing thing, everybody in the room knows it, it's AR, VR, and wideband in the cars, and all of the extreme high bandwidth applications. Otherwise, you don't really need it. So the satellite guys, I think, the Facebooks and the Googles and these guys are going for coverage, right? They're not going for capacity. There's going to be overlap, but I don't think it's going to bother.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the wireless charging.
Sorry?
You can't go back to the wireless charging.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Well, there's a wireless charging expert right there.
Sure. The question I have on those of us in the industry think of ultra wideband as the equal opportunity interference. So with your UWB, what are they doing? The power is so low, according to the SEC. What's the range of what are you doing?
You brought it up.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I know, and there was I feel like where did the Mets play? There was this jet flying over when we were talking, so I missed like the first part of your question, but I think it was just basically, what can you really do with ultra wideband, given the low power?
Right.
Yeah.
And relatively low bandwidth, but.
Yeah, well, that's part of that's kind of the nature of the technology, right? Maybe I should turn over to somebody who really understands ultra wideband technology, but part of it is it's a very low power technology. It operates at a higher low symbol rate, right? It's very, it's easy for the receiver to pick up what the transmitter sends out, right? So, it works well in a very noisy environment, right? It can pick out the signal out of the noise floor. So
and you can get location.
And you get location.
You have enough bandwidth, so you get high bandwidth, narrow time resolution. So a lot of the people who have applications for ultra wideband are also interested in location. It shows up a lot there. It's not universal, but that combination, as I mentioned earlier, is still a big deal.
It's not a communication link. The idea is not to be a communication link, but just to determine presence of a whatever.
Trackers.
Yeah, tracking the human body.
The other question I have is, my experience with 5G is that there's people waiting for it to get standardized, and for the carriers, if you have, I work with a number of medical devices, and they want to put the cellular 5G in their medical device, and the carriers, nobody has their act together. When is this going to happen, do you think?
Yeah.
Don't get sick.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Hold on for a while.
5G enabled, that's gonna be the bridge, right?
Right. So if you're talking about sub-6 in particular, and the standards around sub-6, that's probably the one element of 5G I wouldn't bet my life on happening relatively quick. The good news, though, is that's where the business cases usually break down the quickest, too, right? Because what they're trying to do there, you get a high percentage of with the existing LTE systems. They don't even know with LTE, right? They're still doing LTE advanced plus, double plus, and stuff like that, right? So I think there's still some technology left in LTE that's going to satisfy that sub-6 market.
I can maybe add something to the ultra wideband. There's a company called Walmart that's in Israel, and they make a ultra wideband radar that operates 2 to 7 gigahertz. Depends on what country it's in, and you can buy it on Amazon for like $150 or something like that, and put it in your cell phone. And they use it primarily for imaging walls.
Oh, this is VIR. This is VIR, right? This is VIR.
Yeah.
Israeli, the multi.
The company may be
Right.
The product name is Wall.
Right.
And in fact, I've done one, I used one with a beekeeper,
Yeah.
an exterminator, because one of the problems when you go into a house, is the bees have already gotten in the wall. You have to take a panel off to get them out. And how do you find the bees? They use thermal imaging, but sometimes it doesn't work. But anyway, Eric's comment about presence detection was exactly one application.
Right.
You can get the thing for $150 if you want to exterminate.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So you want to be a sort of weekend exterminator? Invest in this box?
When I retired from the wireless industry.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we've looked at those guys. It's really interesting technology, yeah.
But they build a full chip that's got the radar.
Right.
process, everything.
Exactly. And a whole bunch of different applications
Right,
beyond, you know,
sure.
walls and all that. But other questions? Okay.
So, thank you. Great comment. There's a lot of talk of 5G for industrial applications because of latency and moving the robots and all that. So since it's a fixed infrastructure there, fixed environment, does it have to be provided by carriers? The question is there opportunity for anybody, any entrepreneurs to set up their own 5G networks and get going with applications?
It's kind of the CBRS concept, I think, is sort of the indoor or carrier neutral 5G solution that people talk about a lot. That could easily just be, by the way, just another 4G implementation as well on that spectrum, I suppose. But I think it tends to be the technology bucket that those concepts fall into, right? Although certainly I think some of the operators would just want to do what they do today, right, and try to light up the inside from the outside and provide those level of services.
Well, and there's companies like Helium that's trying to build a network that's very low power, kind of mesh network, if you will, to track things in industrial IoT settings and in sort of logistics settings. Like for example, if you have a set of pharmaceuticals and you want to make sure that you don't have those pharmaceuticals getting to a certain temperature as they go across the country, putting these sensors on and having these sensors be tracked through their network all the way across the country, for example, when the network fully rolls out. I think there are a lot of interesting, especially low power kind of solutions that are being rolled out network-wise.
I'm on the board of a company, it's actually in Sunnyvale, called Future Dial. They do about half of the reverse logistics, that when you turn your old phone in, and it goes back through the channel and they wipe it and clean it. And for the most part, they sell them in Africa, at half price. Some of the more recent generations, they'll resell. You see the refurbished stuff on Amazon sometimes. So that's what they do. And the current state of the art is they've gone as far as they can with manual labor. So all of the factories that do the reverse logistics are all moving to lights out, where it's all robotic. And they have, robots that do cosmetic inspection and do the, testing and all of this. And it's all Wi-Fi. It's all, they would never use this cellular thing. It's totally internally controlled Wi-Fi network to, kind of network between the robots.
Right. You don't want to pay a monthly subscription to anybody for that type of application.
Right.
Wi-Fi works great. It's another good application for Wi-Fi 6, I think, with a low latency. Because I think that robotic control latency becomes a big issue, right? So it is arguably a 5G market.
And the first customer for it was Verizon. They use Wi-Fi.
Right.
There's another question a little bit further forward. Banger in the middle.
Just want to get your guys' thoughts on Amazon Sidewalk. What about that, it's going to work or not, or what it's going to be used for, or even know about it?
Can you explain what it is for those who don't know?
So Amazon's going to deploy a network of 900 megahertz band using the Ring cameras and things like that
To connect,
basically
yeah.
a mesh network.
Yeah, it's another sort of low bit rate IoT type of network concept, right? And the real question is how many of those do you need? I guess in some respects, right? There's a lot of concepts. The fact that Amazon's behind this one gives it a little bit more heft, maybe, than like a lot of startups. Obviously, they talk about their proprietary low power, low bit rate IoT networks, narrowband IoT. So we'll see. I mean, they've got a real need, right? You know, they have issues around not only trying to come up with a good interconnection for their Ring doorbell, say, but also just package monitoring, logistics. That's a big problem for them, right?
Yeah. You know, one of the challenges, it's a very funny thing. Everyone loves that 900 megahertz band. It's just low enough so that you get building penetration and you get range. It's just high enough to have some interesting amount of bandwidth so you can, quote unquote, either put a lot of things in there or do some interesting, you know, functions. But it's a curse. It's a curse and a blessing, because it's the cell splitting thing. If you have a band where you get long range, then you have capacity problems. I was in a business in the 90s where we sold last mile radios before the internet, when you needed private networks to connect instant tellers and that sort of stuff together. You bought these 900 megahertz radios, you didn't need licenses. The problem is we were our own worst enemies. In certain cities in the world, we used up all the bandwidth, we killed our own business. There was nothing. So I think it's interesting at super low bit rate, and performance isn't that big a deal, but it's a blessing and a curse. That one is kind of everybody's favorite, and lots of companies have favorite.
Yeah, and they have some capacity scheme too, if I recollect, right? I can't remember, they had some sort of modulation scheme they had for, some clever that they, maybe they resurrected it, frequency hopping or something like that. But yeah, I mean, to me it's, I'm a bit of a skeptic about 5 things already, but just narrowband IoT.
You're just that way.
Narrowband IoT is just such a tough market, I think, to get to scale, right? Because you are talking about very simple connections, and low cost radios, and pennies per month if you're even charging that way, right? So you really gotta get a lot of things connected before there's any kind of economic impact on those networks. Amazon's the sort of company that can actually, ride out the storm, if you will, right? Can make that actually happen.
Although that's not to
their own
say-
customer.
Because they don't need to make a profit.
But that's not to say a lot of money won't go in chasing these things, right? I mean,
It already has.
I mean, there's 7,000 venture-backed companies have sold in the last 5 years, right? So there's a lot of activity that is happening from all of these, from all of these ideas that may or may not go anywhere in chase of hype.
How many sold at a profit? Do we know?
Well,
It's a different number.
So the interesting thing about that, so 7,000 companies sold, bought by 3,700 companies. So, and the ones that we all throw around in terms of kind of the top 20, only about 6% of those, right? So there's this long tail of buyers. And it's money chasing ideas that we all might be skeptical about, but it's still out there and it's chasing ideas. Somebody believes. Exactly.
I'd like to ask another question. Are you guys seeing any deals outside of handsets in the new CBRS space at 3.65 gigahertz? Or is that?
I was afraid someone was gonna ask. I'm afraid it rained, because it was a while back, that actually got us, they raised money from, I can't remember the venture, I was a little surprised, but it's basically a CBRS radio. That's
For what application?
to like going into enterprise, lighten up the enterprise, and it's almost a little like kind of like the DAS ideas, right? Like a spider cloud type of concept, but using CBRS, more of an active network. So, and I'm not going to be able to think of the name, but the answer is no, not really. But there was that one outlier. So a lot of people are talking about CBRS, right? You hear it from the, it's a Wi-Fi killer, right? One of many. And all the way to this idea that it's going to be, kind of the thing that really enables the carrier neutral network, right? Which has been another holy grail, I think, in the industry, right? That somehow someone's going to build these networks, and a single network's going to serve all these multiple operators, and it's never happened. And I'm skeptical of it.
Because the carriers
Skeptical of it,
don't
sorry.
write prices. They just keep it.
No, they don't, and they don't trust each other either. They just don't want to be riding on someone else's network or outsourcing that to someone.
Any more questions from the audience?
So I have a question.
Hang on 1 second for the mic, 1 second, it's coming to you.
I have a question, something that didn't come up in the discussion, is actually
video up, and it comes up in use cases like in smart cities where you have large numbers of cameras and you need to aggregate this video into the internet backbone. Do you see any point solutions? I think 5G has focused on the video down problem, not on the video up problem.
Yeah, we've looked at a couple of these, which this gets back to the edge sort of question. And what everybody agrees about video is that most of it is worthless, right? And so in every application, right? In even when cars are trying to drive down the street, but so security applications, right? Most of the video that's captured in these city cameras or whatever is useless. And so the issue is who figures out what's useful. And so the big idea, of course, is to use machine vision and inference at the edge, so that you're monitoring the video at the edge, and all you're doing is capturing the stuff that has any content that you care about. And so that you can throw out 99% of your video if you can capture the stuff that has meaningful content, and then that saves massive amounts of storage and bandwidth and storage. And so that's a direction we've seen, as opposed to just trying to massively increase the bandwidth as you massively increase the number of cameras out there.
And not to mention processing power also.
Right, yeah, exactly, right. If you can sort of screen out the worthless stuff before you send it to the cloud and, process all that, right.
I think one of the industry really wants to believe, and it will be true, I think, that's going to be a massive driver for 5G infrastructure in general. And video is just such a bandwidth-intensive application, right? And, you're right, it's everywhere. It's happening.
But
whether it's all useful or not.
Back to the economics of it, though, the question is, if you can create a pipe or pipes that can absorb all the video, you still have a problem at the other end.
Side, yeah.
You got to store it, you got to process it, you got to do something with
That's
it.
where the edge comes in, to your point.
And that's where figuring out what to throw out is highly valuable, right?
Getting it from the sensor to the base station, though, that's the 5G opportunity. I think it's around video, right? That extra bandwidth to deal with it.
Right.
It is really interesting, because you see a lot of, especially in Europe, certain parts of Europe, there's a lot of smart cities solutions companies that are looking for ways to solve a lot of these problems in crime, for example, before it really happens. Youths sitting around, doing things they shouldn't be doing in places they shouldn't be doing it, and how those video feeds are being used is really interesting, right? Because you are starting to see a lot of companies being very interested in that, utilizing that technology, but then being very concerned about privacy and being very concerned about what happens to that video feed if it does go wirelessly to the cloud, and it includes people that haven't been doing anything wrong. It's very complex.
Interesting point. Which reminds me of another. Well, go. Okay. So
maybe a related question. When Verizon introduced 3G, they said now you don't need your Wi-Fi anymore because we have all the bandwidth you'll ever need. Since then, they've obviously embraced Wi-Fi as all the carriers and integrated it into their strategy. With 5G coming, do they still embrace Wi-Fi, or do you think they're going to be pushing it back out? Do you think it's now inherently part of the strategy going forward?
Yeah. I think it's part of the users, it's part of their DNA, it's part of their, connectivity culture, right? People, it's on every device, right? People are used to using Wi-Fi. They like it, provides good quality service. I think we tried to take it away. It'd be a long-term trend, I think, where you wean people away from Wi-Fi. But it's become a generic term for connectivity, right? Hey, Wi-Fi's down.
Eric, I gotta say, if you took your comment out of context, it would be like a telephone guy saying, well, people like their landlines. And, we're always going to have our landlines. And we're used to our landlines.
We know from the last 3 generations, it's not all or nothing. It's not only 2G, only 3G, only 4G. It's a grayscale. So as much as you can say anything you want about 5G, there's still going to be 4G, 3G, 2G, and all of that offloading is still very, very, a very important component.
It's a fair point. But Yeah, that's back to my point about the big tent, right? I think there's a lot of technologies that would fit under that tent as it relates to 5G, and unlicensed can be a big part of it.
Yeah.
Any more questions from the audience?
So another, you reminded me of your Minority Report comment about pre-crime, right? So so we've been looking into the personal mobility space. That's what they call it, right? The personal mobility space, which is to say e-scooters, right? And it seems like a kind of dumb kind of mess. You throw all these scooters out into a neighborhood and you hope somebody's at the right place at the right time and picks it up, and you hope they don't kill themselves, on this e-scooter, and you hope they don't drive down the sidewalk, but you're not sure if you want them in the street. But so there's this, there's this explosion of these e-scooters all of a sudden, but it is a massive, wireless smart city problem to keep track of where all these things are, and then to do the analytics to figure out, where should we move that scooter to make sure that it has the optimal earning power, the next morning. And, one of the scooter companies, I don't know if it's private or not, but one of the scooter companies decided, we're just gonna disable all of our scooters at 1 a.m. Because after 1 a.m., what possible good could be happening on an e-scooter, right? So, they basically decided, let's just disable them for the sake of everyone, which is sort of a pre-crime kind of concept.
It's interesting, actually, just last week on NPR, they had a session that was about crime and policing, and how, I think it was down in Los Angeles, they're talking about this exact thing, like smart cities technology being used to sort of predict crime before it happens, and the privacy issues involved, and even not necessarily camera related, just sort of smart cities related, and sensing people in certain spots, and seeing where crimes have happened, and then dispatching police before the next crime happens. It's a big issue.
Well, all of these location analytics are happening now, right? So, you walk into an airport, you say, oh, I would love to use your free Wi-Fi. Well, you've opted into their network, and now they're gonna, track you throughout the airport. Guess what? They're gonna track you just because you have your Wi-Fi on in the airport. And they're using that for, deciding, SLAs around how many people they should have at each, sort of station. And, what retail is, should be located in which kiosk, and all of that, right? So there's some pre-crime going on already.
Well, the data is all out there. It's how it's being aggregated, right?
Exactly.
And wireless has a very interesting role to play in that. Any more questions from the
Is that a question over there?
Yeah, if I could figure out the mic on.
Weren't you just over there?
We've been tracking you.
I'd be interested in the panel's comment on this. ViaSat was mentioned in the passing on satellites. Well, ViaSat, at least currently, is a geosynchronous satellite. And one of the things that's kind of interesting, everybody talks about how much bandwidth you can get down from the satellite. It's a megabyte. So you're serving a lot of people with a lot of bandwidth. That works, but you got to get the bandwidth up. Whatever you get down, it's got to go up. Now they've addressed this problem. Geo guys have addressed this with spot beams. They put a whole bunch of spot beams in the low frequency reuse plan and make it free. But that only works heading down. How do they get the bandwidth up? ViaSat has a patent on a distributed Earth station approach.
Right.
In fact, they got the big lawsuit with SSL because they leaked the computers. But I'm just wondering if anybody's looked at that deeply, because they claim they can really give high bandwidth at a reasonable cost. And they're saying we don't want to go into the legal business because we don't think the legal business will work out economically.
Yep. So I don't have a lot to add. I'm familiar with what you're describing. I've spoken with Viasat for 15 years probably. It comes in remarkably well, probably as a public company might have. There's really smart management in there. So I would be inclined to really respect their view of the world, right? You look at their marketing around that though, I mean, they show a lot of farmhouses, right, and guys on oil wells. So I still, once again, I think satellite is that type of solution for that type of application. Right? They're not, I don't think they're going to be selling to the urban core with that type of product.
Yeah.
And how they get, how they get it up with them. I'm sure they have that figured out.
If you're broadcasting, it makes sense, but there's no scalability in terms of the two-way.
Well, there is with the
they claim it, right?
Spot beams on the uplink.
Yeah, but then you have a 28,000 mile round trip.
You're right, you can't get around the lakes. There's
Right.
no question about that, but that
Right.
only affects Skype and voice over IP and gaming.
Okay.
Yeah, that's only 99%.
Yeah, right, right. I mean, so there's especially, applications or remote connectivity, but the whole Starlink, idea is you can blanket the Earth with, with these cheap satellites that are, which are cheap to launch and give you, and can generate, a lot of bandwidth and can have two-way, right? With a relatively cheap transceiver.
By the way, it's probably worth noting, I mean, given the satellite question, it's not an answer to your questions too, it's just sort of an add-on. Is that I would say this, we've been talking about what sort of deals have we seen in the last year, and this does relate to wireless, because I made the comment about IoT and batteries. Well, satellites have had, top 3 challenges for satellite systems. You have to get them up there, right? And when it costs, $5 million or $10 million or $50 million or $100 million, and those are real numbers, to get a satellite up, there aren't many, and you only get one shot at it, because if you don't get it right, it doesn't work. And as you know, if you've been following things, and maybe all of you wouldn't follow this, but in the last 3 years, there's probably been, gotta be at least $1 billion, multiple $1 billion on new launch vehicle companies.
Oh, yeah.
All the way from small, the Planet Labs satellites, which are just a couple of pounds, up to slightly larger.
Right.
And there's even some new companies looking at the big guys.
That's space out, right?
So talk about enabling wireless, and since this is the wireless talk, and satellites have always been a big wireless play. At least you get more shots on goal now. I mean, we're gonna see thousands and thousands of satellites. I mean, the companies that are putting these things up are bottomless pits of money. And these new launch vehicle companies are funded. It's gonna happen.
Right.
So now we're gonna get these satellites up there. We're gonna see what happens. I mean, it's not like it's never gonna happen. Back in the old days, it just wasn't, because of the top 3 or 4 things, you couldn't afford to put them off. Back in the Global Star days and all that.
Right. Right.
Now, that's kind of going away. There's even one company that, and they just got funding. I may have talked about this last year. It's a centrifuge that throws the satellites into the air. I kid you not.
You did talk about that, you're right.
It's a centrifuge that's located, that's set at about 30 degrees, and it basically, I spent a lot of time in diligence on this one, but it has to do with dealing with the rocket equation, Most of the weight in a rocket is fuel, right?
Right.
So if you put too much fuel in, you can't go, and if you don't put enough fuel in, you can't get far enough. So it's a really tricky thing, Mother Nature. And these guys basically fling the thing. Now, the good news is they can get it actually into orbit. The problem is, there's so many Gs, it's like 10,000 Gs or 20,000 Gs, you can't kind of put people in it. And it's really actually hard to put devices in, because it actually damages some electronics, so it has to be specially designed.
Right.
But remind me, and I'll tell you, it's not a stealth company.
You know what you remind me of is that there's almost no satellite deal that's too crazy not to get funded. And I think we should come up with a way.
I just looked at
Slingshot, right.
I guess slingshot, exactly. This is my kind of slingshot.
Okay.
Don't get funded.
It's in Mountain View.
But having said that, SpaceX has just filed for permission to put 30,000 satellites
Yeah,
in orbit.
that's the fundamental economic problem. You don't have coverage until you have a big constellation, 7,000, 8,000. And then you got that's because they go fast and you're lower. You have to keep switching. The problem is, you've now got worldwide coverage. 80%, 70% of the world is ocean.
Yeah.
3 guys in a boat out there, how many
Yeah.
are they gonna use? And then over here in this area, sure, maybe lost out those hills for one, but that was valley.
This is kind of related to what Rich said earlier. So with all these satellites, actually, in the last few years, I actually saw 2 companies that, track space junk, right? Because you put that much stuff up there that don't have a tile roof anymore because they're breaking.
Might all be junk according to this.
And another big thing NASA's looking at is companies that are gonna go up and fix the satellites, right? Because when something breaks down, it's like, how do you go fix that? And that's another problem.
But the good news is, there's so much money in some of these companies, which we know who they are, the standard ones, that it's really gonna happen. You gotta love billionaires.
Coming up to our
SpaceX was launched last week, and it was 61 satellites.
Right.
It was the 4th time of their booster reuse.
Right.
And they're talking about taking the booster. I mean, look at the other website, they got a price list for pound of satellite.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Steve, it's not big
Yeah.
cost,
Yeah.
but the question is the CapEx and how you fund this thing.
Tell me you don't need to.
Yeah.
So I think we're coming up on our stopping time, is that right? Tom, am I?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think, if anybody has one last question, I think we have time for maybe one last question. Sounds like we don't have any more questions, but thank you everybody for coming tonight. Thank you, WCA organizers.
So, always a pleasure. You didn't get my notes.
How do you want to do it? Huh? How do you want to do it?
And then it's for
Okay, this is for Trisha?
Huh? No, that's for
I'm just going to take a picture. Sure. Peter, you should go to the show. I'll take a picture, I know. Just on the photo button, right?
Oh.
Sure. Who's got the camera here? Right here. All right.
1, 2, cheese. Just once on the photo button. All right.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. So, I got to. Thank you. It's always a pleasure. All right.
Thank you very much. See you next
Das ist das mal chicken.
Versuch mal, wenn du auf den Knopf drückst. Klappt das?
Ja.